So let's now have a look at the way that Project 3 was structured. Its first section was the Cistercian tradition. So before it begins anything about regulations or government of the order or observances, it attempts a global picture of the spirituality of the order. Then it looks at the local monastery. Following Project 2, it begins at the local level, not with the order as a whole, and then it looks at the order. So the first section is the household of God, Domus Dei, which deals with the observances, then the service of authority, temporal administration, and the reception of brothers. And so that's the local monastery. And finally, inevitably, departures. And then foundations. And the third part is the Cistercian order. And the first section is the whole question of filiation, or the question of collegiality, which was a major issue, which I'll talk about. A major issue, especially in the United States region and the Spanish region, and to some extent in South America. The question of clipping the wings of the Abbot General after the experience of Gabriel Sorte, and arriving at a more collegial form of government in concordance with what had been established by the Charter of Charity, with the general chapter as a whole as the highest authority in the order. So the first question was this idea of filiation, the relationship between a founding house and the house it founded. Then the assemblies of the order, plural, in which the recognition of the regions was provided for. Until then, the regions had no juridical authority. They'd come to be against a certain amount of resistance because it was thought to impugn the uniformity that the chapter of 1892 had so insisted upon. The assemblies of the order, the officials at the service of the order, so they're not the bosses, but abbot generals and divinitors and the like are officials at the service of the order. They're not the ultimate authority in the order so much as they're there to help the order run smoothly. And what were the novelties of Project 3? This is just to list them. I'll explain where they come from in a moment. So it made a provision for the communal celebration of the sacraments of anointing of the sick and reconciliation. The emphasis being on the cenobitic quality of the life would demand a greater attention to communal celebration of some of these things. The question, the key constitution, it seems to me, and certainly the key to Project 3 was the co-responsibility and subsidiarity. We'll see this in greater detail later on. And then participation in the Church's mission that we are not just existing for our own sake, that we are there to serve the church in some way. That we offer assistance to those seeking a deeper prayer. In other words, there's an overflow from our own contemplative life, that we offer assistance to those seeking the ecumenical significance, that because we're not so stringently bound to the institutional church and all its pomps and works, that we can have a greater facility for dialogue with those who are not of the same disposition. A positive attitude towards monks' families, saying they should be given a special welcome and so forth. This was scoffed at by a couple of eminent members of the order, but others had stories to tell of how badly their families had been treated when coming to visit and so forth. There's a point about the beauty of the monastic environment and the preservation of the earth's resources. You see, this is 1983. This is before all the work that's been done in more recent times. The emphasis on training for work, that people shouldn't just be given a job and hope that obedience will do the rest, but if they're given a job, they should be trained for it. The importance of paying attention to the human development of monks and nuns, and if possible, if necessary, to make use of professional help in this. The question about the ordination of monks, that the community should be consulted. Bernardo Oliveira was particularly insistent on this, that too often ordination became a kind of privilege that was reserved to those who were in favour, in the good eyes of the abbot. But the community should be consulted before anyone is ordained, even though there's no legal requirement for that. And that the newly ordained should have supervision. They should be trained and supervised by an experienced priest. And there was also the possibility of cultural pluralism. So put together that you can see that, yes, there were a lot of novelties in Project 3, and these were the kind of things that attracted a great deal of dissension, a great deal of criticism, a great deal of trumpet blowing and virtue signalling by people about the way things had always been done. But looking back on it 40 years later, they seem to be fairly desirable, most of them. But let's just talk about the theology of Project 3. The theological heart of Project 3 revolves around the theme of fraternity. Now this may seem obvious after Pope Francis's encyclical Fratelli Tutti, but it wasn't all that obvious in 1983. And let me tell you how it all came about. Well, the day after the last meeting of this group of the Law Commission and Evaluation Commission at Laval, they pushed, I was sitting towards the end of one end of the table, and they pushed this box so big, full of all the comments that they had received on Project 2, pushed it up to me and said, "It's all yours now." And as I said, there was a certain animosity or antipathy towards having to give up the project that they'd worked on for 15 years, more or less. And I was fully aware that I hadn't been thinking much about constitutions, and I didn't have a clue. I'd never read the constitutions, for example, as far as I knew, and I didn't have a clue of where to start or how to go about it. And I had a very uneasy night that night, and I got up the next morning and everybody went to Lourdes, and I decided that I wouldn't go to Lourdes. I went for a walk instead, and it was a very misty morning, and I didn't know where I was going, which was a symbol of something, but walking off into the mist, without a thought in my mind, and walked and walked and walked, and eventually decided I was hungry enough to have breakfast, so I turned around and came back. But then all of a sudden the idea came into my head as the way to centre the constitutions, and that was the use of the word brothers, the idea of fraternity. That we wouldn't talk about the monks or members of the community, we would continually say, the brothers do this, the brothers do this, the brothers do that. We would use the indicative voice, not the subjunctive, but the brothers, and to try and give the whole thing a fraternal tone. And when I reached back at the gate of the monastery, Bernardo Oliveira was there, like the father of the prodigal son, looking out for me. He thought I'd done a bunk and escaped from this impossible task. And I said to him, I've got it. I said, I can go ahead now. I know how to, I will just simply evolve around this theme of brotherhood, of fraternity. The community is a community of brothers. And this was intended as a reaffirmation of the specific Cenobitic character of Cistercian Conversatio. Those of you who remember would know that in the 70s and the 80s there was a lot of movement towards the eremitic life and emphasis on building hermitages and so forth. This was a reaffirmation that Cistercian monasticism was Cenobitic. And this fraternal emphasis brought with it a number of overtones. The first was an acceptance of life in community in all its richness as being the first and essential component of the Cistercian ideal. The community, the local community, is the focus of everything. And it's a community that is a community, not just a juridical notion, but that really strives to build up communal values, values of interaction, of fraternity, and of communion. The second was to go beyond the community and to recognize the ecclesial character of monastic life, the monastic community being seen within the context of the Church as mystery, Lumen Gentium. And the third characteristic was a respect for human values, the humanitas, typical of the tradition of St. Benedict and strongly apparent in Gaudium et Spes, the Vatican II document on the Church in the modern world. And these three things, the community values, the ecclesial character, and the respect for humanity, were really the kind of core values that I tried to incorporate in, shall we say, recycling a lot of the previous canonical material. Tried to reshape it according to these values. And it came up with a sentence which I think is particularly important in the first part of the Constitution: Conversatio Cisterciensis Cenobitica est. The total vindication of the Cistercian life as Cenobitic in all that inquires. The other thing that is perhaps a bit novel in Project 3 was its insistence on our patrimony. And for many people that word was not even familiar, the Cistercian patrimony. Because the post-conciliar generation is characterized by a rupture with tradition and a certain uprootedness, Peter Berger wrote a book called The Homeless Mind, He's saying people don't have roots anymore. They're just drifting around. They go from one place and associate with that and go somewhere else and associate that with the deep traditions of humanity have somehow been lost. And what I was trying to compensate for was to give a strong sense that we are not just fly-by-night form of monasticism, but we have deep historical roots. And these roots are life-giving. And so I felt it was important to insist on a certain emphasis on the tradition and on our patrimony, and to do this less tentatively than the 1969 General Chapter did. 69 General Chapter, under the influence, I think, of Augustine Roberts, did move in this direction in a certain way. But to do this more overtly and more unambiguously, to assert our Cistercian patrimony, to use the language of our tradition, to evoke and to allude to elements of our tradition wherever possible. And so we had this first part of the constitutions, which was devoted, which had almost no juridical consequence, but it was devoted to an elaboration of our patrimony. Holyoake decided that this first part was of sufficient importance that it should be studied by all the commissions. I think that was a nice compliment to the idea. They said, yes, there's something here that everybody needs to look at. The other parts were all blocked out, and different commissions studied different bits, and it was pretty much the luck of the draw. Now, this first part remains, I think, a very important section of the Constitution. Far from being pious window dressing, it's the foundation of all that follows. The Cistercian patrimony, in its fullness, is constituted by the entire body of writings which derive from or flow into the mainstream of monastic belief and practice, as well as by the lives of innumerable brothers and sisters who have, throughout the centuries, laboured to transmit the Cistercian life to the succeeding generations. What you might notice about this statement is that it's not merely a matter of texts, it's not merely a matter of the writings that we can go into the library and check out, but there is another source of contact with our tradition, and that's in the concrete lives of innumerable brothers and sisters who have, throughout the centuries, laboured to transmit the Cistercian life to succeeding generations. Mostly they are anonymous, of course. Mostly they don't go down recorded, but to try to give expression not only to what is found in the texts, but also to what has been lived and handed on by a great many people. So we arrived at Holyoake, a traumatic experience for many European abbots who were completely confused by the fact that when they walked through the streets of New York in their habit, people were looking at them as though they were some sort of strange creatures from outer space, which in a sense they were. We went to this large convent in Holyoake in Massachusetts. We took up, the 100 or so participants in Holyoake took up, I suppose, less than a quarter of the whole building. It was large enough for the sisters would be riding around on scooters inside the corridors. It was that large. A particular source of entertainment for me was watching the French abbots confronted with a huge American buffet breakfast. They didn't know what to do with it or what vessel to put what in. And there were some comical situations emerged from that. But eventually the chapter got down to work when we checked out the voting system and the electronic system and so forth. And finally, a committee was established to deal with the text. And these are they, the Holyoke Constitutional Commission, called COCO. 5 people there. The first in the luxuriant beard is Armand Veilleux, who was responsible for one of the great innovations of that chapter, which was the computer. And that meant instead of people having to type and retype the same texts and so forth, it was possible to produce texts progressively and very quickly so that they could be voted upon. Of course, it needed quite a lot of equipment in those days, a large unit and printing and so forth, and the results were fairly ungainly, but it got through the work much quicker than we would have otherwise. The first person then, starting from the left, is Armand Veilleux, Marie Gérard Dubois, the abbot of La Trappe, who was the I suppose the darling of the French-speaking monasteries. He's a very intellectual man, of great intellectual rigour, shall we say. In the centre was Bernard Johnson from the Law Commission. Mother Danielle was there, representing the nuns, and then finally myself. So these were the people who had to do most of the work during the chapter. We were joined by Dom Cyprian, the abbot of Tilburg, who was something of a Latinist, who helped us to produce the Latin text or to make it a little bit more elegant. What we had to do, the job we had to do, was to arrive at a suitable text. First of all, a text that could be submitted to a vote of the Assembly in a meaningful way, which means that it was broken up into small enough pieces that people could vote on each element rather than everything bundled together, to which some might agree and some might disagree. So the first task was the practical task of arriving at a suitable text, and then to seek the consensus of the capitulants. That was the second task. And then eventually to be in accord with the groundswell, with the way the communities were thinking, that in some way the text that we arrived at, actually this is what people wanted to feel about their monastic lives. This gave some explanation of what their own experience of monastic life had to offer. And for that we had to rely on our own intuition and our own experience and our own contact with members of the order. And finally, we had to be observant of what I've called a constitutional architecture, to be respectful of the way constitutions are meant to be written. They weren't meant to be performed as a dance. They were meant to be performed as a fairly stark legal text, with little glimmers of inspiration where possible, but fundamentally it had to pass muster as a recognizable as a book of constitutions. So the general chapter of Holyoke, during the 44 sessions of the Holyoke chapter, Project 3 was taken apart, minutely examined, and from its elements a new and better text emerged. It wasn't perfect. It was a question of preserving the spirit while updating the expression of what it was describing. There's a great deal of fear and suspicion initially, and the favourite image was of the Trojan horse. People were saying, we didn't have enough time to study this, we don't know what consequences will be drawn, we're afraid that we let this this text into our lives, we'll suddenly discover that it explodes and destroys us. And it was a very popular image. It came up any number of times, the Trojan horse. Discussions were spirited, but surprisingly, a remarkable degree of consensus emerged once a spirit of trust was engendered. Once they saw that we're actually working through every single number of the constitutions. We were submitting them to amendation, we were improving them, we were refashioning them, we were combining them or setting them apart. That the work was being done with a degree of integrity. And if you look at that constitutional committee, you'll see that there are people there of widely divergent views and widely divergent aptitudes, so that good work was done. And eventually the chapter as a whole began to trust the texts that were being submitted to them, that there was no Trojan horse, there was no secret agenda behind all this. Except for one, a superior of this country, who voted negatively in almost every ballot. In fact, Armand Veilleux did a bit of spy work and found out who it was, and found out that he'd unscrewed the voting element and left it fixed in the negative position, while he himself read novels for the whole of the chapter. So if anybody's open to bribing me, I'll tell you who it was. But he voted negative to every vote, except one, and abstained from the final vote. And the only proposition that he accepted was number 29, the abbot is a major superior with authority both in the internal and external forum. He was one of those who wanted the local abbot to be declared to be a supreme moderator, so that he wasn't under any abbot general or general chapter. As I say, for many of the abbots, it was all about enhancing the power and authority of the local abbot. Apart from this eccentric exception, the chapter evinced a zeal for the unity of the order, a respect for its differences, and a willingness to compromise over non-essentials. This led the Abbot General, Ambrose Southey, to conclude the chapter by saying, although there were differences of opinion, the spirit of this chapter has been one of the best that I've known. So the chapter did produce something eventually.
When I call, answer.